The first sound I heard that morning was water dying. Not rain. Not a hose. The hard metallic groan of a release valve opening all the way, followed by thousands of gallons dumping into the gutter like somebody had decided the middle of July was the perfect time to waste a small miracle. I was barefoot before I was fully awake, hitting the back porch with sleep still stuck in my eyes, and the concrete felt cold under my feet even though the Texas heat was already rising off the fence line. The smell hit me first after that, wet cedar, hot plastic, and that sharp mineral scent you only get when stored rainwater hits sunbaked ground. Then I saw her. Brenda Whitmore stood beside my tank system in a spotless white tennis skirt, one hand on the brass valve wheel, the other holding her little HOA clipboard against her hip like she was posing for a magazine spread called Women Who Ruin Things. Water rushed past her designer sandals in a muddy stream, curling through my side yard, slipping under the gate, and pouring straight into the storm drain at the curb. 4,800 gallons. Gone. Just like that. She glanced up when she heard me coming and gave me that smile of hers, the one that always looked too polished to be real. "You're welcome," she said. "That ugly setup was turning your yard into a sanitation issue." I stopped 3 feet from her and just stared. The tank stood along my fence in a clean row, dark green poly barrels linked by copper fittings and drip lines I'd installed myself over 2 weekends and a lot of quiet nights. Nothing about them was broken. Nothing about them smelled wrong. They were legal, permitted, screened with cedar lattice, and feeding the one thing in this neighborhood that actually brought people together without a board vote, a patch of raised beds 2 blocks over where retirees, single moms, and kids with dirt under their fingernails grew tomatoes, beans, basil, and hope. Brenda didn't know that. Or maybe she didn't care. With her, both usually looked the same. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, and I build things for a living. Decks, pergolas, fences, the occasional kitchen remodel if the numbers make sense. My hands are rough, my truck is 12 years old, and I've learned the hard way that if you want something to last, you don't trust appearances. You trust the frame underneath. 3 summers ago, after my wife passed, I stopped sleeping much. So I started building instead. First the planter boxes. Then the catchment gutters. Then the tanks. Then the drip manifold that ran like veins out to every thirsty root in the community garden behind St. Luke's. What started as a way to keep my own tomatoes alive through drought restrictions turned into a backup water supply for half the block's produce. Kids who couldn't tell mint from weed started showing up on Saturdays. Mrs. Alvarez from the corner brought pepper seedlings in old yogurt cups. Mr. Donnelly, a retired mechanic with knees like bad hinges, built trellises from scrap conduit. It became the only place in Willow Creek Estates that felt like people still knew each other. And now I was standing in my own yard, watching the HOA president drain it into the street because she thought tanks looked poor. The valve kept whining. The runoff kept shining in the sun. Brenda tucked one blonde strand behind her ear and looked me dead in the face like I was the problem. What she didn't know was that she hadn't just emptied my rainwater tanks. She'd just shut off the community garden in the hottest week of the year. Brenda always smelled like lemon polish and expensive perfume, like she had built her entire personality out of clean surfaces and rules nobody voted for. She gave the brass valve one last little twist with those manicured fingers, then stepped back to admire the damage the way some people admire fresh paint. I could hear the hollow glug inside the tanks now, that miserable echo that tells you something useful is almost gone. Behind me, the early light was sliding over my backyard fence, catching on the copper lines, the hose clamps, the pressure gauge I had mounted by hand with a socket wrench and a level. Every piece of that system had a reason for being there. I knew because I had put it there one long evening at a time. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the scene she was clearly hoping for. I looked past her, down at the stream cutting a dark path through the St. Augustine grass, carrying weeks of careful planning. Out to the curb. "You had no authority to touch that," I said. Brenda laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because she enjoyed the sound of herself being certain. "Authority is exactly what I have, Ethan. That eyesore has been a problem for months. Then she turned and walked out through my side gate without waiting for an answer. White visor, white shoes, white SUV parked at the curb like she was starring in some suburban campaign ad for order and taste. The gate clicked shut behind her, and all I could hear after that was water finishing its escape. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. Long enough to feel the heat start to climb. Long enough to smell dry cedar and wet soil mixing into something bitter. Then I moved. First I shut the valve. Then I checked the lines. Then I grabbed the binder from the mudroom shelf. I keep records the way some men keep trophies. Receipts in plastic sleeves. County permit copies. Rainfall logs. Sketches with measurements in pencil. A signed letter from St. Luke's Outreach Board confirming shared use of my reserve water during municipal restrictions. Most people in Willow Creek Estates thought the community garden just happened by magic, like tomatoes appeared because somebody posted about sustainability on social media. They never saw the work under it. The half-inch feeder line buried along the alley. The filter housing I cleaned every other Sunday. The float valves. The overflow routing. The little chart on my garage wall that tracked storage by the gallon because one dry week in August can wipe out lettuce, peppers, and beans faster than people think. I looked at the level marks on the tanks and felt my jaw tighten. She had drained almost everything. Enough to cripple the drip schedule for days. Enough to hit the garden right when the soil was already stressed and the forecast showed 6 straight days over 98. I thought about the kids from the apartment complex who came on Thursdays to water the beds. I thought about Mrs. Alvarez clipping herbs into paper bags for neighbors who could not get to the grocery store easily. I thought about old Mr. Donnelly pretending he only came to fix hinges when really he just liked sitting in the shade and talking about how his father used to grow pole beans in East Texas. That garden was not decorative. It was food, routine, and pride stitched into 12 raised beds and a tool shed that leaned a little to the left. By 7:15 that morning, my phone had started buzzing. One text from Mrs. Alvarez asking why the basil rose looked limp. Another from the church volunteer coordinator saying the drip timers had not kicked on. I stared at Brenda's tire marks by the curb, still sharp in the dust, and felt something settle cold and steady in my chest. She thought she had cleaned up my backyard. She had no idea she had just touched something this neighborhood depended on. By 8 o'clock I was parked behind St. Luke's Fellowship Hall with the engine off and the windows cracked, listening to the little sounds that usually got buried under morning traffic. Cicadas in the pecan tree. A loose downspout ticking in the heat. The dry papery rustle of bin leaves brushing one another where they should have been cool and open from the first watering cycle. The garden looked wrong before I even stepped through the gate. You learn that when you build things that depend on balance. Healthy systems have a rhythm to them. This one had lost its pulse. The top inch of soil in the tomato beds had already started to crust over, and the basil near the south fence hung limp like somebody had taken the air out of it. The drip lines lay quiet in the mulch, black tubing curled under the sun, doing nothing because there was nothing left to push through them. Mrs. Alvarez was already there in her straw hat, holding a pair of pruning shears in one hand and a grocery sack in the other. She looked from the wilted herbs to me, then to the timer box mounted on the post. I thought maybe the breaker tripped, she said. I reset it twice. I crouched by the filter housing and unscrewed the clear canister. Dry. No pressure. No reserve. Just one stubborn bead of water clinging to the mesh before it dropped into the dust. It is not the timer, I said. The tanks got emptied this morning. She blinked at me, not understanding at first because normal people do not imagine somebody would do something that stupid on purpose. Then she understood all at once. Her mouth tightened. That woman. She did not have to say Brenda's name. Around Willow Creek Estates, people said it the way folks talk about hailstorms or foundation cracks, like an expensive problem you pray passes your house. I stood up and looked over the rows. 12 raised beds. 2 pollinator strips. 1 compost station. A potting bench built out of salvaged cedar from a deck job I did 2 years back. Kids had painted the cinder blocks around the herb spiral in bright colors that had faded in the sun. Blue handprints. Yellow ladybugs. One crooked red carrot with the word grow written underneath in a second grader's shaky lettering. Every piece of that place had been earned. Tuesday evenings after work. Saturdays before the heat got mean. Donated lumber. Discount mulch. Church bake sale money. Rain caught off my gutters and stored because the city watering rules got tighter every summer and because I knew exactly how fast goodwill dries up when people have to choose between saving cucumbers and paying a water bill. That is what Brenda never understood. She thought anything practical looked cheap. She thought if it was not decorative, it was disposable. Around 9, the volunteer kids started showing up with sun hats and little gardening gloves, and that was the part that made my stomach turn. There is no clean way to explain to a 10-year-old why the cucumbers are curling and the marigolds look tired because an HOA president decided your water system offended her sense of style. I kept it simple. We had a problem with the supply this morning, I told them. We are going to keep the roots shaded and buy some time. So we spread straw. We checked stakes. We picked the ripe tomatoes before the vines gave up more moisture than they could spare. But by 10:30, the heat was pressing down hard enough to make the air over the bed shimmer, and I could see the damage coming like weather. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a photograph from one of the neighbors across from my house. Brenda was back at my fence line with 2 members of the HOA landscaping committee, pointing at the empty tanks like she was showing off a renovation. The text under the photo read, "She is telling people she solved a code issue." I looked out over the garden, at the drooping basil, at the little painted blocks, at the families who counted on this place for more than vegetables, and I felt that same cold steadiness settle deeper. Brenda thought this was a private dispute. A clipboard matter. A curb appeal victory. She still had not figured out that the thing she touched had roots all over this neighborhood. That afternoon, the heat settled over Willow Creek Estates like a punishment. By 1:30 the air above the sidewalks looked warped, and every parked car on my street shimmered under a white Texas sun that made chrome too bright to look at straight. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, and for a second I just sat there with both hands on the wheel, listening to the little ticking sound my truck made when the metal cooled. My tank stood silent along the fence, dark and hollow now, and the sight of them hit harder in daylight than it had that morning. Empty infrastructure always looks like accusation. The cedar screening I built around them threw striped shadows across the concrete pad. The gauge sat at 0. The copper manifold was warm to the touch. All that careful work, all that stored-up patience, and Brenda had treated it like yard clutter. I went inside, washed the grit off my hands, and opened the binder on the kitchen table. Then I opened the second binder. Then the file drawer by the refrigerator. I do not believe in arguments when paperwork will do. By 2:15 I had spread half my life across that table. Permit approvals from the county environmental office. Invoices for the tanks, filters, valves, and backflow preventers. A diagram of the catchment layout with measurements in inches and slope notes in the margins. Copies of my email exchange with St. Luke's Outreach Board from the previous summer when the city first tightened watering restrictions and the garden needed a reserve plan that did not depend on public pressure lines. There it was in black and white, signed by Reverend Caldwell and the volunteer coordinator, a shared use agreement authorizing emergency and supplemental irrigation from my privately maintained rainwater storage during drought periods. Not symbolic. Not casual. Documented. Useful. Real. My phone buzzed while I was flipping to the maintenance logs. A notice from the HOA portal had landed in my inbox. Subject line, Courtesy Compliance Resolution. I opened it and laughed once, not because it was funny, but because sometimes arrogance is so clean on paper it almost becomes art. According to Brenda, the unauthorized exterior utility structures on my property had been voluntarily remedied after prior warnings, and the neighborhood should expect continued visual improvements as the board worked to preserve community standards. She had written herself a victory speech before lunch. Worse than that, she copied the whole subdivision mailing list. By 3 o'clock, responses were trickling in. A couple of the usual people thanked the board for protecting property values. Someone asked whether other unsightly installations would also be removed. Then Mrs. Alvarez replied with a single sentence that changed the temperature of the room without changing the weather. Those tanks feed the church garden. After that, things got quiet for almost 10 minutes. Then another message came in from a father whose 2 boys worked the Saturday beds. Then one from a nurse who picked produce for her elderly neighbor. Then one from Mr. Donnelly, all caps because he never did trust his reading glasses, saying the board had no business touching private equipment tied to a community food program. I watched the thread build like pressure in a line. Facts do that when you leave them alone long enough. At 4:10, Brenda responded. Her message was short, polished, and full of that soft poison she always used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something rotten. She claimed no one had informed the HOA of any official connection between my backyard system and the garden. She described the tanks as potential mosquito hazards and stated that any incidental outside use had not exempted them from appearance standards. Incidental. That word stayed with me. Thousands of gallons collected, filtered, logged, and routed through a system I designed, and she called it incidental because admitting value would mean admitting fault. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the kitchen window at the dry line on the side of the nearest tank, a pale ring marking where the water used to sit. Then I got up, walked into the mudroom, and pulled the memory card from the security camera over my side gate. The plastic was warm from the day. The footage loaded fast. 8 minutes and 13 seconds. Brenda entering my yard. Brenda examining the fittings. Brenda gripping the valve and turning it until water thundered out. No confusion. No emergency. No contractor. No sanitation team. Just her, alone, making a choice. I watched it once. Then I saved 3 copies. Outside, somewhere down the block, I heard the whine of an electric leaf blower and the thin bark of a dog that always sounded offended by existence itself. Regular neighborhood noise. Regular suburban afternoon. But at my kitchen table, with permits on one side and video evidence on the other, the whole thing stopped feeling like harassment and started feeling like a case. The next morning started with heat already sitting on the roof like it had never left. By 6:30 the gutters were warm, the birds were louder than usual, and the air had that dry metallic taste that comes before another 100-degree day. I was in the garage with my laptop open on the workbench, the security footage paused on Brenda's hand wrapped around my brass valve, when Reverend Caldwell called. His voice came through thin and scratchy at first, church office phone quality, but I could hear the strain underneath it. "Ethan, I just got off with Denise from the pantry team," he said. "We lost half the lettuce overnight, and the peppers are starting to curl. Do you know how long before we can get the system flowing again?" I looked at the empty level marks on the maintenance chart taped to the wall and told him the truth. Without rain, without city water, and without the reserve, not fast enough. He let out a slow breath that sounded like old wood settling. "We have 14 family boxes scheduled for Friday." That number stayed with me after we hung up. 14 boxes. Tomatoes, herbs, cucumbers, squash when the vines behaved. Nothing glamorous, but enough to ease a grocery bill, enough to make somebody's week stretch a little further. I closed the laptop and drove to the County Records Annex on Mason Road, a low beige building with flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of paper, toner, and stale air conditioning. I knew what I had at home, but I wanted the rest. Board minutes. Architectural guidelines. Fine schedules. Any mention of environmental infrastructure exemptions, drought mitigation, or utility screening. If Brenda was going to play queen of appearances, I wanted every rule she had ever hidden behind laid flat on a table. The clerk at the front desk knew me from permit pulls and fence easement copies. She slid the public file request form across the counter and said, "HOA trouble," in the same tone people use when they ask whether your truck is still making that noise. I nodded once. 20 minutes later I was standing over a metal table under buzzing lights, turning pages that smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. There it was, tucked into a revised design appendix from 2 summers earlier. Rainwater collection systems permitted if screened from street view, maintained in sanitary condition, and compliant with county code. Permitted. Screened. Compliant. I took copies of that page, the board approval stamp, and the committee sign-off. Then I found something even better in a packet from the previous fall. St. Luke's Community Garden had been featured in the HOA newsletter as a positive example of neighborhood volunteerism. They had used pictures of the harvest day. Kids holding baskets. Mrs. Alvarez smiling under that straw hat. A line in the caption thanked local residents for supporting sustainable irrigation efforts during water restrictions. Supporting sustainable irrigation efforts. Brenda had literally praised the result of the system she was now pretending she knew nothing about. By noon I was back at my kitchen table with fresh copies stacked beside the binders, and the whole story had changed shape in my head. This was not just one woman being petty. This was documented knowledge, public praise, followed by private interference and a false victory email to the subdivision. Around 1:15, another HOA message hit the community thread. Brenda announced an emergency board meeting for that evening to address escalating resident concerns and misinformation regarding unauthorized backyard structures. The wording was smooth, practiced, almost elegant in its dishonesty. She was trying to get in front of the facts before the facts got a microphone. I stared at the message, then at the still frame on my screen showing the water exploding out of my tank line into the yard, and I felt something in me settle for good. Up until then, I had been defending permits, logs, explanations, clarifications. That was over. Brenda wanted a meeting. Fine. I had the county language, the church agreement, her own newsletter praise, and 8 minutes of high-definition video. For the first time since I heard that valve open, I did not feel drained. I felt ready. The clubhouse always smelled like burnt coffee, lemon cleaner, an old carpet that had absorbed too many fake smiles over too many years. By 6:45, the folding chairs were filling up under the fluorescent lights, and the low hum of side conversations moved around the room like static before a storm. I came in carrying one banker box and my laptop bag, not because I wanted to look dramatic, but because paper has weight, and sometimes people do not understand the truth until they can hear it hit a table. Brenda was already at the front beside the long laminate board desk, dressed in another white outfit that made her look less like a homeowner and more like a walking surrender flag nobody had asked for. She had her clipboard, her little bottle of sparkling water, and that composed expression she always wore when she thought she had already won. On the wall behind her hung the framed Willow Creek Estates motto in tasteful script: community, beauty, harmony. I remember looking at those words and thinking how often people use pretty language to cover ugly behavior. The board members sat in a row beside her, shuffling packets and avoiding eye contact with anyone who looked upset. Mrs. Alvarez was there in the second row. Reverend Caldwell came in right behind me, still in his work shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open from the heat. Mr. Donnelly lowered himself into a chair near the aisle with the slow, careful movements of a man whose joints had opinions. I noticed more people than usual from the church side of the neighborhood, and fewer of Brenda's usual nodding supporters than I expected. News travels faster than water in places like this. Brenda called the meeting to order with a plastic tap of her pen against a ceramic mug. Her voice came out smooth and practiced. We are here tonight to address growing confusion surrounding exterior code compliance and recent misinformation that has caused unnecessary community tension. Misinformation. There it was again, that soft-polished way of naming reality as a nuisance. She clicked a remote, and a slideshow appeared on the projector screen behind her. My fence. My tanks. Cropped angles, carefully chosen to make the cedar lattice look cluttered and the plumbing look industrial. She had turned my backyard into an exhibit. These unapproved utility structures, she said, have generated multiple resident concerns involving appearance, sanitation, and neighborhood consistency. I watched heads turn toward me. Some curious. Some sympathetic. Some just hungry for spectacle. Brenda kept going, building her little case out of half-truths and confidence. She said the matter had been resolved after the homeowner failed to remedy prior violations. She said the board acted in good faith. She said no official documentation had ever been submitted proving the system had any sanctioned community function. That last sentence landed in the room and hung there. I could feel people deciding what they believed. That is the thing about a lie told calmly. It borrows the shape of order. When she finally paused and asked whether any residents wished to comment, I stood up. The chair legs around me scraped lightly on the floor. The room shifted. I carried the banker box to the front table and set it down between us with a dull cardboard thud that made Brenda's smile twitch at the edges. Then I laid out the first stack. County permit approval. Design appendix language authorizing screened rainwater collection systems. Purchase invoices. Maintenance logs. Shared use agreement with St. Luke's. The old church newsletter clipping with the harvest photos and the line about sustainable irrigation efforts. Brenda's eyes moved from page to page, and for the first time since this started, she looked like she had to think. I plugged in my laptop without asking. The projector screen blinked black, then came alive with a still frame from my side gate camera. Date stamp in the upper corner. Time stamp underneath. Brenda in white, one hand on the brass valve. Nobody said a word. Even the air conditioner sounded louder. I looked at the board, then at the room, then finally at Brenda. You said there was no documentation, I said. There is. You said the system had no sanctioned community use. It did. You said the board acted in good faith. You did this yourself. Then I hit play. The video ran for 8 minutes and 13 seconds, but the room turned on her in less than 30. There is something about seeing a person do exactly what they denied doing that changes the air. Not rumor. Not opinion. Motion. Choice. Intent. The projector light washed Brenda's face pale as the footage showed her entering through my side gate, stopping at the tanks, looking around once. Then gripping the brass wheel and opening it until water came surging out across the yard. You could hear it in the clubhouse speakers too, that hard rushing sound, like a creek where no creek should be. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. Even the board members stopped shuffling papers. Brenda stared at the screen with her mouth slightly open, caught between outrage and calculation, like she was searching for a version of events where everyone else was still stupid enough to believe her. When the clip ended, the final frame froze on her hand still resting on the valve. Reverend Caldwell stood up first. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Our pantry lost produce this week because of that decision, he said, each word slow and steady. Families who count on those boxes lost food because of that decision. Then Mrs. Alvarez rose from the second row, one hand braced on the chair in front of her. You took water from children's vegetables so the fence line would look prettier, she said. That is what you did. There are moments when a room picks a side without voting. You can feel it before anyone says it out loud. The people who had nodded along with Brenda's emails all summer suddenly found the table type fascinating. One of the board members, Greg Hollis, a mortgage broker with a red tie and a habit of talking too much when things were easy, cleared his throat and asked whether legal counsel had reviewed any of this before action was taken. Brenda snapped back that the board had broad authority over aesthetic violations, but her voice had lost that polished glide. It sounded thinner now, stretched tight. I slid one more document across the table, the county design appendix with the rainwater exemption highlighted in yellow. Then I placed the St. Luke's agreement on top of it. Then the printed screenshot of her community newsletter praising sustainable irrigation efforts. You knew enough to celebrate the garden when it looked good in a newsletter, I said. You just did not care where the water came from. A man in the back, one of the dads whose boys helped mulch on Saturdays, stood up and said Brenda had sent him a message the month before asking whether his family would support tighter enforcement against non-conforming yards. Another woman said Brenda had described my tanks as junk that would be gone soon. Every sentence added weight. Every memory clicked into place. This was bigger than one valve, 1 yard, 1 hot week. This was a pattern with polished edges. Brenda tried one last time to seize the room. She said she had acted for health and safety. She said the system appeared unsanitary. She said homeowners could not simply assign private property public importance without board review. That was when Mr. Donnelly gave a short dry laugh from the aisle seat. "Lady," he said, "you are talking about a screened, permitted water system like it is a pile of tires behind a trailer." A few people laughed then, not kindly. The sound hit Brenda harder than anger would have. Her authority had always depended on people being too intimidated to find her ridiculous. And now, under the fluorescent lights, with the projector humming and her own actions frozen 10 feet high behind her, ridiculous was exactly what she looked like. Greg asked for a recess. Another board member seconded it too fast. Brenda objected. It did not matter. The room had already moved past her. As people stood and clustered into low urgent conversations, my phone buzzed in my pocket. County Environmental Enforcement had replied to the email I sent that afternoon. They wanted the footage, the permit copies, and a formal statement first thing in the morning. I looked up at Brenda as she gathered her papers with stiff angry movements, and for the first time since I heard that valve open, I knew she understood the shape of what was coming. By 7:30 the next morning, the county office parking lot was already throwing heat back at the sky. My boots clicked across the concrete with that hollow morning sound public buildings always seem to have, and the banker box in my arms felt heavier than paper should. Inside, the air conditioning hit cold and dry, carrying the smell of toner, dust, and old file folders. Environmental Enforcement was on the second floor. A woman named Carla Mendez met me at the front desk with a legal pad, sharp glasses, and the kind of no-nonsense expression that told me she had spent years listening to people lie badly. She led me into a narrow conference room with one metal table, 2 padded chairs, and blinds that cut the sunlight into pale stripes across the wall. I set the box down, opened the laptop, and walked her through everything in order. Permit approval. Layout diagram. Shared use agreement. Maintenance logs. Newsletter reference. Then the footage. Carla watched the whole 8 minutes without interrupting. When it ended, she rewound the part where Brenda placed her hand on the valve and froze the frame. "Did you authorize her to access the system?" she asked. "No." "Did the Homeowners Association have a county order allowing intervention?" "No." She made 2 notes, then asked for the board's legal contact, the subdivision management company, and the date of the emergency meeting. Her pen moved fast and steady. "This is not a gray area," she said finally. "Permitted private infrastructure cannot be tampered with because someone dislikes the appearance, especially where there is documented community use tied to drought mitigation." That sentence felt better than any speech I could have written myself. By 9:15, certified notices were already being prepared. 1 to the Homeowners Association. 1 to the Property Management Company. 1 directly to Brenda as board president. Unauthorized interference with permitted water collection and distribution equipment. Potential civil liability. Review of board conduct. Required preservation of all related communications and records. I drove straight from the county office to St. Luke's, where the garden sat under a hard white sun that made every leaf edge look sharper than it should. The basil still drooped, and a few lettuce heads had already gone bitter in the heat, but volunteers were there anyway, moving slow in the shade cloth, doing what people do when they care about something fragile. Reverend Caldwell came out from behind the tool shed carrying a hose nozzle in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He asked how it went, and I handed him a copy of the county notice. He read the first page once, then again slower. "Well," he said, looking out over the beds, "that is going to travel." He was right. By lunchtime, half the neighborhood had seen some version of the letter. People forwarded screenshots. Someone posted a cropped image of the county header in the residents group. Brenda tried to get ahead of it with one more message, claiming an outside agency had been misled by incomplete information and that the board remained committed to protecting community standards. But the words landed flat this time. Facts had already beaten her into the room. Around 3 in the afternoon, the management company sent a formal notice of a special board session to review leadership conduct and emergency procedural violations. They did not use Brenda's usual soft language. They used words like exposure, liability, and removal. That evening, I was back in my yard with a hose hooked to the city spigot, feeding just enough water into the first tank to prime the garden lines for the night cycle. It was not ideal, and the meter would sting later, but the drip manifold clicked alive one section at a time, and the sound was the closest thing to relief I had felt all week. Water moved through the black tubing with a quiet, purposeful hiss, and I stood there in the fading light with one hand on the cedar post, listening. Across the street, a curtain shifted in Brenda's front window. I did not wave. I just watched the first tank level rise by one thin line on the gauge. She had drained water to prove she had power. Now every gallon going back in was proof she did not. The special board session happened on a Thursday night under the same fluorescent lights, but the room felt different from the second I walked in. No slideshow. No polished opening speech. No little sparkling water bottle waiting by Brenda's elbow like she was hosting a luncheon instead of answering for what she had done. The management company had sent one of their regional attorneys this time, a grey-suited man with rimless glasses and the calm expression of somebody billing by the quarter hour. He sat at the center of the long table with a neat stack of printed notices in front of him and called the meeting to order without once using the word harmony. Brenda still wore white. Of course she did. But it did not have the same effect anymore. It did not read crisp or commanding. It read like a costume she had forgotten to stop wearing after the part was over. The county notice had done exactly what notices like that are built to do. It stripped the performance off the problem and left only exposure. Liability. Documentation. Conduct. Those words were on everybody's tongue now. The attorney read the findings into the record in a flat, even voice. Permitted private infrastructure. Verified community use. Unauthorized interference. Potential damages. Failure to follow governing procedures. Failure to preserve trust. Every sentence landed with the dry finality of a stamp hitting paper. Brenda tried once or twice to interrupt, saying she had acted in good faith, saying she had a duty to respond to resident concerns, saying appearance standards could not simply be ignored because somebody attached a charitable purpose after the fact. But every time she spoke, another document answered her. The county appendix. The signed agreement. The newsletter. The footage. It is hard to keep pretending you are the authority when the record keeps reminding everyone you were just the person nearest the valve. When the vote finally came, it was not dramatic. No shouting. No gasps. Just one board member after another saying the same word in slightly different voices. Yes. 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 Removal from the presidency effective immediately. Temporary suspension from Architectural Enforcement Authority pending legal review. Mandatory reimbursement discussions to follow through Carrier Council. Brenda sat very still after that, both hands folded on the table so tightly the knuckles went pale. She looked smaller somehow, as if all the square footage she usually occupied in a room had finally been measured honestly. Nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. The quiet was better. Outside, the August air wrapped around me the second I stepped from the clubhouse, thick and warm and carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block. My phone buzzed before I reached the truck. Reverend Caldwell had sent a picture from the garden. The drip lines were running clean again under the mulch, and in the center bed one of the kids had stuck a hand-painted sign into the soil. Water is back. The letters were crooked. The joy behind them was not. I drove there before going home. The sky was turning amber over the church roof, and the first thing I heard when I came through the gate was that soft, steady ticking sound from the emitters, each one releasing exactly what it should, no more and no less. Basil leaves had lifted. The cucumber vines were still tired, but they were alive. Mrs. Alvarez was clipping herbs into paper bags with a look on her face I had not seen all week, something between relief and stubborn satisfaction. Mr. Donnelly sat on his upside-down bucket near the trellis, pretending he was only there to Inspect the repairs. I stood by the main valve box and looked out over the rows, over the painted cinder blocks, over the little sign, and for the first time since Brenda opened that brass wheel, the air did not feel tense. It felt settled. That night, back at my house, I topped off the tanks under a sky that finally looked like it might give rain. The gauge climbed slowly in the porch light, line by line,